Have you ever felt like someone was watching you, even when you were completely alone? Or heard a sound in the dead of night, one you know you didn't imagine? What if the scariest stories aren't just stories, but warnings? Some fears fade with the light of day, but others, they stay with you forever. Tonight, I'm going to share 3 terrifying stories that will make you question what's lurking just beyond the edge of the darkness. This happened when I was 19. I'm 24 now. I live in Jacksonville, Florida. It was my senior year of high school, right around the time when everything started shutting down due to the pandemic. Quarantine was in full effect, but somehow my friend group and I were going out more than ever. With all the non-essential businesses closed, there wasn't much to do except explore. And for me, that was perfect. I've always had a thing for urban exploration and haunted places. Even now, I still go on the occasional late-night adventure. It's not that I'm fearless, but I've had my fair share of close calls, run-ins with homeless people, strange encounters with cult-like groups, and one time, even a guy pointing a gun at me. But nothing, and I mean nothing, was as bizarre or unsettling as what happened that night. At the time, I'd just started talking to this girl named Vanessa. We had a class together but had never really connected until recently. I somehow convinced her to come with me on a midnight adventure to Grove Hollow Nature Preserve, a large, wooded park just outside the city. It's a beautiful place during the day, peaceful and serene, with hiking trails and small creeks. But at night, it's a different world. Local police regularly patrol the entrances to keep people out, and for good reason. Back in 2017, a 22-year-old woman named Rachel Dunn was found murdered in those woods. She'd been stabbed over 20 times. And just last year, some teenager was shot while exploring. But I figured we'd be fine. I'd been there before. We arrived at the park around 2:45 a.m. It was pitch black, and the trees were so dense that barely any moonlight got through. I'm not a fan of using flashlights when I'm exploring. They ruin your night vision and make you an easy target for anyone watching from a distance. Vanessa stayed close to me, gripping my arm as we made our way down the main trail. It was eerily quiet, not even the usual hum of insects, just silence. After about 20 minutes of walking, I decided to take a shortcut. There's this narrow, unmarked path that loops back toward the main entrance, and I figured it would be faster than retracing our steps. Vanessa seemed hesitant, but followed me in. We'd only been on the path for a couple of minutes when we heard it. A flute. Soft at first, like it was distant, but it got louder. It wasn't just random notes either. It had a rhythm, a cadence, almost like a melody from an old folk song. Vanessa's grip on my arm tightened, and I could hear her breathing quicken. I'll admit, I'm usually pretty good at keeping my cool, but this was different. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize it. A busker practicing in the middle of the woods at 3 a.m.? No way. The sound wasn't coming from a specific direction either. It echoed all around us, like it was seeping through the trees themselves. I whispered to Vanessa, just stay calm, but she wasn't calm. She started praying, whispering for God to protect her and forgive her for her sins. And that's when I knew she wasn't just scared. She was terrified. The music grew louder, closer. It felt like whoever or whatever was playing it was right on top of us, yet there was no one in sight. My heart was pounding in my chest. I'd had enough. I told Vanessa, we're running, now. We sprinted down the trail, branches scratching at our arms and legs. I'm pretty sure the flute had stopped, but I was so focused on running that I didn't notice. Then crack. Something huge dashed across the trail in front of us. It moved so fast I didn't even see it, but I felt it. Like the air around me shifted from its size. Vanessa gasped, stopping so suddenly that I almost ran into her. The sound of twigs snapping echoed from the direction it had come from. My mind immediately went to deer. They're big, fast, and unpredictable. But something about this didn't sit right. I'd seen deer dart in front of me before, and this wasn't that. There was no shape, no clear silhouette, and it didn't sound like it kept running. It was just gone. Go back. Go back, Vanessa muttered, tugging at my sleeve. We turned around and sprinted, but as soon as we reached the spot where we'd first heard the flute, it started up again. This time it was different, louder, closer. The rhythm had changed too, like some kind of warped Irish jig, but it still followed that same eerie cadence. My chest felt tight with panic. We were trapped. I had to make a choice: head back down the unmarked trail where something big had just crossed in front of us, or return to the main trail where the flute player clearly was. I didn't want to go back into the thick woods. It was darker, more confined. The main trail, at least, was a clear cement path, and I'd rather face whatever was playing that flute than walk into the unknown. The main trail. Run, I said, and we bolted. Adrenaline turned a 20-minute walk into a frantic 7-minute sprint. We ran non-stop, lungs burning, branches whipping our faces. Somewhere along the way, I noticed the flute had stopped. Or maybe it hadn't. I was too focused on getting to the truck. About halfway back, we passed a lone porta potty just off the trail. I'd seen it earlier but hadn't thought much of it. Now, though, it felt like the most menacing thing in the world. My brain flooded with thoughts of someone hiding inside, waiting to jump out. I didn't stop to check. When we finally reached the parking lot, I'd never felt such relief. My truck was still the only vehicle there. No sign of anyone else. I'd half expected to see a car parked next to mine, maybe someone's lights flashing, but it was empty. I've never driven away so fast in my life. The next day, I told my friends. They laughed, said it was probably some weirdo playing a prank or a sound carrying from the neighborhood on the edge of the woods. But I've been in those woods plenty of times. The nearest houses are miles away, and the flute's sound was too clear, too sharp. It wasn't an echo. It was right there. Vanessa backed up every detail, and without her, I'm not sure my friends would have believed me. I've gone exploring since then, but I've never set foot in Grove Hollow again. I've looked online to see if anyone's had similar experiences, flutes in the woods, ghost stories, anything. But all I've found are the usual ghost sightings, cults, strange noises. Nothing about a flute. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else entirely. But every time I think about it, I get the same chills I felt that night. I'll never forget it. I don't know who or what was playing that flute. But I know one thing for sure, it wasn't alone out there, and neither were we. I live with my boyfriend, Ethan, in a small but cozy house he owns in Willow Glen, a quiet suburb just outside of Portland. Our house is modest compared to the larger homes in the neighborhood, but it's perfect for us. It's a single-story, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house with a basement, and it sits on a private, tree-lined street with only 6 other houses on the block. The way the street curves gives us an unusual amount of privacy, as no other houses face ours directly. There's also a patch of woods at the end of the road, giving it a secluded feel. One weekend last October, Ethan went to Los Angeles for a bachelor party, leaving me alone from Thursday to Monday. On Friday, I decided to have a wine night with some friends from work. We were all hanging out in the living room watching scary movies when the doorbell rang. We all froze and exchanged uneasy glances. It was close to midnight, not exactly prime time for unexpected visitors. I crept toward the door and peeked through the small frosted window at the top, but I couldn't see anyone. Our driveway had 3 cars parked in it, so whoever it was had to know people were home. My friends and I agreed it was probably just a case of ding-dong ditch, and we laughed it off. Still, it left me feeling unsettled. After my friends left, I double-checked that the front door was locked, then went to bed. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing not once, but twice in quick succession. My heart jumped into my throat. My first thought was that maybe one of my friends had forgotten something and come back, but when I checked my phone, there were no missed messages or calls. Feeling uneasy, I called Ethan. He answered, his voice muffled by the sounds of a noisy bar. He stepped outside to hear me better. "Don't open the door," he said firmly. "Just stay in the bedroom, keep the door locked, and call me if anything else happens." He didn't suggest calling the police, so I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably nothing. Just as I started to feel calm again, I heard it, a clicking sound sharp and deliberate, like metal tapping against glass. My heart stopped as I realized it was coming from the living room window. A second later, there was a knock. Not a soft tap, but 3 loud, deliberate bangs. Then, a man's voice. "Hey, is anyone home? I need some help out here," he said, his voice scratchy but loud enough to hear through the window pane. I thanked every higher power that the blinds were closed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. He knocked again. "I know you're in there," he said, this time more forcefully. That was it. I grabbed my phone and called 911, speaking in a hushed whisper so he wouldn't hear me. I reported an attempted break-in. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed on the line, crouched in the corner of my bedroom, until the dispatcher said officers were on their way. I didn't hear the man leave, and that was the scariest part. For all I knew, he was still standing outside my window. When the doorbell rang again, I felt a jolt of terror. But this time a man's voice announced, "It's the police." I peeked through the top window and saw two uniformed officers on the porch. I opened the door, and the taller officer stepped inside without being invited. His partner stayed behind him, silent and watchful. "We're responding to a disturbance call," the tall officer said, glancing around the room. I quickly explained what had happened, telling him about the man tapping on my window and my scene. But instead of taking me seriously, the officer raised an eyebrow and said, "Did you see him? Did you actually see him?" "No," I admitted, "but I heard him. He knocked on the window and spoke to me. I know what I heard." He let out an exaggerated sigh. "Ma'am, if you didn't see him, then how do you know it wasn't just someone walking past? People walk around neighborhoods all the time." I was stunned. "He knocked on the window," I repeated. He said, "I know you're in there. That's not someone just walking by." The officer gave me a patronizing smile. "Well, we can't arrest a man for walking around. If you don't have a description, there's not much we can do." His partner remained silent, his eyes scanning the house, but he didn't say a word. They did a quick walk around the property, shining their flashlights at the windows and down toward the woods, but it didn't feel like a thorough check. I watched them through the blinds, and it was clear they weren't taking it seriously. After less than 10 minutes, they returned. "Nothing out there," the tall officer said. "Keep your doors locked." Then they left. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound made me flinch. When I finally did doze off, I woke up drenched in sweat, thinking I'd heard knocking again. The next night was Halloween. My friend Lacey was throwing a party, and I was looking forward to being around other people. I dressed as Velma from Scooby-Doo, and Lacey went as Daphne. The party was loud, fun, and just what I needed to get my mind off the night before. I got home just after 1 a.m. and noticed something was off right away. The air inside was cold. It felt like a draft, and I figured I must have left a window cracked. When I walked into the kitchen, I saw the window over the sink was wide open. I closed it, locking it tight, and tried to remember if I'd opened it earlier in the day. I couldn't recall doing so. Then I saw it. The basement door, wide open. I froze. We never leave the basement door open. It stays closed at all times because it sticks to the frame, and you'll have to tug it hard to open it. Slowly, I approached it. My pulse was racing, my breathing shallow. I peered down the dark staircase, but couldn't see anything past the first few steps. Click, click, click. That same sharp, metallic sound echoed from the basement. My heart stopped. Then I heard it, a low, gravelly voice drifting up from the darkness. "Finally home," it said, like it had been waiting for me. I slammed the basement door shut and ran outside, not even bothering to grab my coat. I banged on my neighbor's door until they answered. I called 911 from their kitchen, and this time I wasn't taking any chances. When the same two officers arrived, I was ready. I demanded they search every inch of the house. They looked more serious this time, maybe because my neighbor was watching them closely. They checked every room, closet, and cabinet. When they reached the basement, I stood by the door, straining my ears for any sounds. They emerged a few minutes later. "Nothing down there," the tall officer said, but this time his cocky grin was gone. He glanced at me, then at his partner, and they exchanged a look I didn't understand. That was the last time I stayed alone in that house overnight. For months, I wouldn't sleep there without Ethan home. We installed cameras on every entrance, and I triple-checked the locks every night. I don't know if the man in the window ever came back, but I know one thing: whoever was in that basement knew I'd be home eventually. I'm a 24-year-old man, and I work as a medical supply technician at a mid-sized hospital in southeastern Georgia. My shift runs from 7 p.m. to 5 a.m., and one of my main duties is restocking the emergency rooms with essential supplies. I work 7 nights straight, followed by 7 nights off. The work stretch can be brutal, but the week off feels like a mini vacation. My work schedule runs from Friday to Thursday, and on the 6th night, a Wednesday, I decided to leave a bit early to stay with my girlfriend at her cousin's house about 25 minutes from our apartment. She had been house-sitting for her cousin while they were on a trip, and since the house didn't have any curtains, she'd been feeling uneasy. I didn't join her earlier in the week because of my shift, but that night she sounded extra anxious, so I told her I'd come over. She's usually pretty stubborn, but I could tell she felt relieved. Working night shifts for the past 3 years has worn me down mentally, and I'm pretty sure I've developed mild insomnia. After getting to her cousin's house, I couldn't fall asleep. Not surprising. But it was frustrating since we had a packed schedule the next day. We had to drop her cousin's kids off at school, attend a baby shower for one of our friends, go grocery shopping, since we'd been away from home for 3 days, and then I'd have to head back to work for my final shift. I dozed off in the car for about 10 minutes before we dropped the kids off. But that's all the sleep I got. I chugged an energy drink and had my girlfriend drive me to work since my car's brakes were bad and I didn't trust myself to drive on 0 sleep. By the time I'd clocked in, I'd been awake for nearly 40 hours. The shift started smoothly, and as long as I stayed busy, I could push through the tired fog. I put in my earbuds and zoned out to music while stocking supply cabinets in the emergency wing. The ER stays active with late-night cases, so I'm used to nurses or doctors popping in to grab things. When I'm in the room, I usually glance up, nod, or smile. That's why, when I heard the high-pitched squeal of the door's hinges and the heavy thud as it closed, I naturally turned to see who had come in. But there was no one there. I figured maybe someone had opened the door, seen me, and decided to check another room. Shrugging it off, I got back to work. About 10 minutes later, I moved to the next room, which was dark. As I opened the door, I swore I saw someone crouched by the supply cabinet. It looked like they were digging through the medical waste bin, the kind used for disposing of needles and used vials. This wasn't unheard of. A nurse had been fired a few months earlier for trying to steal pain meds. I flipped on the light, ready to confront whoever it was, but there was no one there. The cabinet door was closed and the waste bin lid was down. I'll admit it freaked me out a little. I'd been awake for so long that I figured I might be hallucinating. I'd read that sleep deprivation can mess with your mind after 30 hours, and I was on hour 39. Still, it's one thing to know that's possible, and another to experience it. I brushed it off, finished restocking the ER, and went back to the central supply room at around 3 a.m. Every night, we're responsible for delivering patient-specific supplies to the nurses' stations on each floor. Each floor in the hospital is set up the same way. There are 3 elevators at the center. When you step off the elevator, you can go left to reach the 3,100 and 3,200 wings, or right to reach the 3,400 and 3,500 wings. Each wing has 15 rooms, so the layout's easy to navigate. On this particular night, the 3,400 and 3,500 wings on the 3rd floor were empty due to renovations. Patients had been relocated to other floors. When I got to the 3rd floor, I dropped off supplies at the nurses' station on the 3100 side and decided to walk down the deserted 3500 hallway. It's weird how much creepier empty hospital rooms feel compared to the emergency rooms, which are always busy. I'm used to quiet, empty spaces, but this felt different, more unsettling. As I walked down the hall, I heard the metallic rattle of a hospital bed's side rails coming from room 3512. I'd seen housekeeping check rooms like this before, so I figured it was them. But as I passed by the door and glanced in, I saw a man lying in the bed. He was convulsing like he was having a seizure. Blood poured from his eyes, nose, and mouth. The monitor next to his bed blared an emergency alarm. The sight of it stopped me in my tracks. My stomach flipped, and my heart pounded as I pressed myself against the wall near the doorframe. This man needed help. I'd seen patients code before, and it's always a frantic scene. But this was different. There was no one around. I'm not a nurse, but I knew I had to act. I stepped into the room, ready to call for help, but the man was gone. The bed was empty, neatly made, no blood, no monitor,